Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my great pleasure to be interviewing today Robert Blood, who's the founder and managing director of SigWatch. Robert, welcome.
Thank you.
So with no further ado, Robert, in the interest of time, let's turn to our questions. But my first question to you is to ask you to say a little bit about the evolution of SigWatch, its purpose, and how it has grown over the years, to set the context for the other questions.
Well, our aim is to try to bring NGOs and business closer together, but not in the conventional way of, of engagement and having the two sides talk to each other, but rather trying to understand campaigning activity, activism, as a phenomenon in global society, and from that, deducing what the emerging issues are, what the arguments are, what NGOs really want, how they are framing their arguments, and then helping business to understand the big trends that they are living in so that they can then plan themselves for a future that is more aligned with the way that public opinion is invariably going to go.
And
So
have you
we've been doing
seen?
that for multinationals. So we've been doing that for multinationals now for many years. They tend to be the most exposed types of companies. So obviously they're very interested in our perspective. But one of the things we keep hearing from NGOs themselves is that we, in many ways, have done the sort of the heavy lifting for them when they go in and meet a big company. The company's already very aware of those NGOs' positions, what their arguments are, what they're really concerned about, so they can start to talk brass tacks rather than just dancing around the issues.
I see. And how do you think activism and I suppose litigation as well, how have you seen it evolve in recent years? It seems to have, from an outsider's point of view, it seems to have surged considerably.
Yes, I think in fairness, what we're seeing surge is actually the reporting of activism rather than activism
Mm,
itself. So we've observed a fairly consistent flow of campaigning on a global basis, but particularly in Europe and North America. Those are the strongest regions for activism, but there's a lot
mm,
in Latin America and in parts of Asia as well, and even Africa, in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa has a lot of activism, for example. So what we're seeing, I think, is a public interest and a media interest in what activists are
mm.
saying, and of course, it's the climate issue that's really delivered a large part of that change in sentiment. I think it's
Yes.
clear from what's happened just this week with the British Prime Minister doing a U-turn on whether to go to the climate summit in Egypt.
Yes.
That
Yes.
wasn't just NGO pressure; that was public pressure. It was a general feeling that yeah, climate change is a really important issue, and that wouldn't have
Mm.
got there without activism.
Mm. And greenwashing as a phenomenon seems to have taken off massively, partly due to regulation. But what do you see as the drivers behind the current focus on greenwashing? Do you think it's regulation? Do you think it's the public? Do you think it's greater awareness generally? What do you think the key drivers are?
It's absolutely the activists. I mean, they put
Mm,
greenwashing on the map. They have made it a both a term of abuse, but also a way of looking at the behavior of companies, the
mm,
ethics and hypocrisy sometimes of companies, which had not really got much attention, and particularly not from the media. So this sort of
mm.
comparing what a company says it's doing versus the real world
Yeah.
impact of what it's doing is the key to greenwashing. And
Mm.
it's not a question that's been driven by regulators or lawyers. It was started by the NGOs, and regulators and lawyers have picked it up since then.
Yes. So do you think now companies are focusing on it and preparing to engage in a more meaningful way? Because I mean, you talk about the NGOs, and I'm sure that they are the key drivers of the whole thing. But shareholders are now much more concerned, stakeholders are more concerned, employees are more concerned, customers are more concerned. Do you think that the companies have beginning to get their act together in addressing the underlying issues?
I think undoubtedly yes, although some are making more progress than others, and some are I think, are prepared to go beyond the easy parts more than others. So, the likes of Unilever, many of the big banks, particularly European banks, have made huge progress in their own lights, in fairness, on addressing fossil fuels, their investments in fossil fuels, the use of that, whether it be, the direct use through transport or indirect uses like plastics. So, and that's come about because activists have keep pressing the issues. But I think the key
Mm.
stakeholder that you were identifying there is actually investors. Um,
Yeah.
it's not a coincidence that the tipping point for business taking climate change seriously was the same tipping point that pushed ESG from the fringe to the mainstream of portfolio
Mm.
management. When company managements were being challenged on their climate policies, their environmental policies, their human rights
Yeah.
policies by their investors, they had no choice but to take it very seriously.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I think that the financial markets generally are a very good instrument when it comes to delivering change in relation to climate change and getting corporates to take it seriously. But what about the new phenomenon that people are talking about, green hushing, where companies, as a result of accusations to the other people, perhaps not to themselves, of greenwashing, are now not lifting their heads above the parapet, so to speak?
Yes, I'm not sure how seriously to take that.
Mm.
It's obviously the lawyers have got in there. I mean, they said,
Yes,
if you
they're
don't say
everywhere.
anything, you can't be sued for it.
Mm.
But in the end, they're still companies are still required to do something. They're still
Mm.
required to meet regulatory requirements. They're required to produce annual reports on their sustainability behavior. They're required to disclose their climate impacts. And if they're not required by law, they're required by their investors, or their investors are demanding it. So I think the
Mm.
hushing part is there is very limited how far companies can go to not talk
Yeah.
about what they're doing when they're still going to have to do it anyway.
Yes, if anything, it will attract a very hostile reception, won't it, I suspect, if they do that or try to
If
do
they
it
can
for
get
too
away
long.
with it at all. I mean, look at what happened to HSBC
Yeah.
by doing something which actually companies have been doing for decades, which is to, they see that public interest is in green energy, environmental initiatives. So they thought, yeah, okay, let's talk
Mm.
about what we're doing in that area. Where's the harm in that? And the
Yes.
Advertising Standards Authority said, actually, that is no longer on. And
Yeah.
I think it's striking that the ASA have clearly taken as their precedent for that what they've been doing on nutrition for some time. So
Mm.
it's no longer allowed, for example, for companies to promote nutritional benefits, fringe benefits, like, for example, vitamin fortification in a product, for
Mm.
example, a children's cereal that is otherwise very heavy in sugar, which is
Yeah.
intrinsically unhealthy. And you can see it's the same concept that a bank cannot promote the fact that it's spending, a few tens of millions on wind farm investment when
Mm.
billions are going into fossil fuels. It's exactly the
Mm.
same idea, and it's not surprising, therefore, that regulators have recognized that this is actually something they want to stamp down on. And indeed, a lot of the regulators, advertising regulators, consumer regulators, are now taking up this mission. And it's not going to stop at environmentalism. It's going to look at human rights. It's going to look at social rights. It's going to
Mm.
look at, for example, racial equity. It's not
Yeah.
enough to have a policy on racial equity. What have you actually done? How many minorities
Mm.
do you actually have on your board?
Yeah.
It's going to be about what are you doing, not what you say.
Absolutely. Walking the talk, as the Americans would say. I think that that's entirely right. Now, our time is almost up, Robert, but is there one question perhaps that you'd like to pose to our audience, but before we meet on the 22nd of November, that you'd like them to think about? What is the key issue that corporates should be aware of at the present time? What should be top of mind currently in relation to this subject?
I think it's about how to establish an honest approach to the issues. It started with being aware of the issues, then it moved to talking about the issues, then it moved to trying to do something about the issues, And now I think
Yeah.
it's at the stage of what have you actually achieved on this issue? Can you put your hand on your
Mm,
heart and say that you actually have addressed the real needs of minorities or your workforce or the environment or biodiversity or material waste minimization? And
yeah.
that's going to be the test. And no, let's accept it. Companies like Unilever have kind of blazed a path for this. They've shown that it can be done.
Mm,
So there's not much excuse for business or their advisors to pretend that this is still a difficult problem.
very good. I think that's a good note on which to leave this. Robert, thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to continuing this conversation at the Climate Litigation and Activism Summit on the 22nd of November in London. I
Thank
very
you.
much look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very
We're
much
looking
indeed.
forward to speaking there. Thank you.